You've heard it all before. Modern gaming has no soul. These days, games are produced for profit with any sense of artistic merit being lost in heaps of AAA titles that are created by companies obsessed with existing IPs or intellectual properties. Corporations are afraid to take risks. Or do they have an agenda? Are they putting ideology above profits, content to lose money for the sake of activism? Is it all a conspiracy to undermine the West? Either way, things used to be better. Gaming used to be better. Well, maybe not. Half those arguments are mutually incompatible. Half of them are observations on affordability, and the other half are unevidenced conspiracy theories relating the quality of the work to other traits. When these beliefs unite, when the impulse to conspiratorially blame the left and minorities unites with real economic problems, bad things follow. Degeneracy is a dangerous word for that very reason. It signifies equally a sense of a culture in decline as well as a behavior. The implication is that people are doing things that undermine our culture. The broadest sense of cultural decline is a bit easier to argue, where the need to convince the public is concerned. The watchword of pathologically negative discourse around the arts, especially digital media, is slop. We're all slop consumers living in a slop culture, eating our slop food and watching our slop movies. Are we reading slop books? Are we driving slop cars? Have we given ourselves over to slop production and slop living? Well, maybe not. I remember a time when I was excited for new releases, for a ton of games with exciting new experiences or new opportunities to re-experience old works in new ways. That time was earlier this year in 2025, and last year in 2024, and 2 years before that in 2022. The games that came out in those years are some of the ones that have impacted me the most in my life, every bit as much as some of the releases from 2011 or 2014 that held so much joy for me then as now. Alternatively, I didn't really experience a lot of new games in 2023, and I didn't really do so in 2013 either. I was content with what I had, but when I do have new and negative experiences with games, it takes me back to all the times I got a new game as a kid, and it had entire sections that were so broken as to be unplayable, or game-breaking glitches that meant starting from scratch every time. I don't love the limitations of the Xbox Series S, but I didn't love the red ring of death either, so you'll forgive me if I don't get lost in nostalgia. See, the flip-flopping of a lot of those earlier arguments relies on one fundamental conceit, the conflation of profit with quality. Ironically, this way of thinking presents, at least to my eyes, like an outgrowth of the belief that the cream of culture rises to the top of the market. The better your art, the more money you'll make, right? Wrong, unfortunately. We can tell this is a faulty observation through logic alone. We have no reason to believe market success is indicative of merit without evidence, and the typical evidence given is either that if people like a piece of media, they'll pay for it, or that we know the most financially successful works are the works of the highest quality, because if the work is that good, it will succeed. Usually you hear these arguments side by side, but sometimes not. The first of those two arguments, that if it's good, it will make money, is a conflation of popularity with quality. If you believe this, you must necessarily follow that argument to its implied conclusion, that mainstream media with the greatest degree of popularity is the best media. You can't go around decrying Marvel slop if you believe this. The largest corporations are the ones with the greatest reach, after all. Then the unfairness becomes clear. People will start to notice the problem when they see someone being given something that they don't have. What they don't always see is that this distinction also exists in their own eye. Cultural bias can just as easily create an uneven playing field as if people were starting from different financial positions. Remember, we're talking about quality here. How do you know you're not the one who's misled by your own ability to see what's good? It's not as romantic as believing you're a rare truth teller going against the grain, but it's still possible. The second of these arguments, that the best works are the most financially successful because the works of the highest quality will succeed, is a tautology. It's a case of circular reasoning. The question, how do you know, isn't being answered here. We're just affirming the belief. Statements like this are mantras, useful as self-soothing but not insightful as commentary. The problem with the fallacy is that it doesn't necessarily lead you to the truth, even if the conclusion of the argument is true. To embrace this way of thinking is to reject any attachment to the truth itself. In context, we're making the truth a thing that exists to make us feel good. What happens when we embrace goalpost shifts and circular reasoning in our beliefs? What happens when we buy into these arguments? We're seeing the post-truth reality. The observation that truth is a social relation is a descriptive one. Far from being a relativistic view of what is and isn't true, it's an observation that people will exhibit behavior that is inconsistent with the idea of an absolute reality. The stakes of this situation are that we lose our ability to connect with one another. In order to truly evaluate how to approach that situation, however, we first need to be able to see the real, actual problems here. When we see the rising price of games, for example, there's no mystery there. Prices generally rise over time without outside interference because the stable profits businesses can extract from their products aren't actually stable. The need to extract more and more from their consumers, from the environment, from everywhere, is a function of the need to stay profitable and competitive. The further downstream result is that businesses have real incentives to do less for more. Where the market is God, greed is good, and if that's all true, isn't it a severe mistake to conflate profitability with quality? You could almost see the barest thread of the argument that people who talk like that embody a worldview that is fundamentally incompatible with the arts. In fact, I've made that argument. It seems like we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. There's a fundamental perverse economic incentive at play here, but if we can't object to the conditions that give rise to those behaviors, if we can't act against them, then we can't move forward with addressing the problem. This makes attacking those types of criticisms while also bemoaning the conditions created by the problems they attempt to address fundamentally hypocritical. Certain people hate the symptom and love the disease. They hate the effect and love the cause. Stances like this are the result of ideology because they're predicated on inviolate priors, or other more foundational beliefs that we aren't willing to give up. This isn't inherently objectionable. Everybody has a belief they wouldn't want to give up. But when we begin to embrace these kinds of contradictions in our worldviews, we're giving up a reason. The people who proactively advocate in this way are undermining our social landscape. The word for beliefs like this is rationalizations. A true rationalization occurs when, despite the evidence, we reverse engineer a belief about ourselves or the world that exists to flatter our feelings. Students of psychology are probably familiar with the origin of the phrase sour grapes. The fable goes that there's this fox wandering through the forest and he sees some grapes. He thinks about how sweet the grapes might be, and so he reaches up to try to get a mouthful. His problem? Foxes are not extremely tall animals, and these grapes, they're a bit too high for him to reach them. Convinced now that he won't be able to reach the grapes, the fox keeps walking. He feels put out because now he doesn't have any grapes, and he really wanted those grapes. A few feelings flashed through his mind. It would be convenient if he didn't want those grapes, because then he wouldn't feel bad. It would be convenient if the grapes were sour, because then he wouldn't want them. So the fox decides that the grapes were sour, and he didn't want them after all. There are other examples of sour grapes rationalizations. In literature, we have the character Gollum in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Gollum, real name Smeagol, has this cousin Deagol. Smeagol and Deagol are out fishing, and Deagol finds this beautiful ring. The ring, being an evil and corrupting force, ensnares Smeagol, who covets it. Deagol doesn't want to give it to him, so he kills his own cousin. Kinslaying being something of a grave moral offense, Smeagol feels guilty. He's a murderer. How could that possibly be justified? Well, it was his birthday. Smeagol wanted the ring. It could have been his. In fact, by all rights, it should have been his. If Deagol hadn't been so selfish, it would have been his. By all rights, it was his. Deagol took something from him. He wasn't the thief, it was Deagol who was the real thief. Smeagol was just defending what was his. He was justified. It was all Deagol's fault. Just like that, someone comes to believe something that is either totally unevidenced or even the opposite of the truth because it's what flatters them. Am I the president and I want to be popular, but I'm being told my public approval is down in the polls? No, it isn't. People love me. I want them to love me, and I know they love me, so my numbers can't be down. Did I hurt your feelings? Well, that's your fault for being so sensitive. If you're oversensitive, then my actions weren't the problem, which is pretty convenient for me, since it means I don't require any further self-reflection. In fact, all these types of beliefs seem predicated on convenience. It's characteristic of us to be driven by emotion. We can think fast, but we feel faster, and our ability to retain information has a strong relationship to our emotional state. Our ability to reason comes after our willingness to feel, but that's also the point. Logic can function as a check on our emotions. To the best of our ability, it can discipline what we feel to what we can demonstrate. Doing so is worth the effort it takes to check ourselves, to self-reflect, difficult though it may be. Despite this, I think there's a real reason to believe we can't just tell people gaming is fine. True, it's wrong to catastrophize about the situation, which a lot of people do. There's a lot of great games being made everywhere, especially if we expand our horizons beyond AAA productions, but people have a sense that something is wrong, and that they feel that way is a real issue. Just telling them to feel something else probably doesn't help. This is precisely because of what we were able to observe earlier, that there's a systemic function of capitalist economics that manifests in the market forces we see in the games industry and create these undesirable outcomes. One fact does not drive out the other. Many of the arguments about gaming are histrionic and based on faulty rationalizations of ideological positions that refuse to admit the problem, and yet there is still a problem. Modern gaming isn't dead. But that phrase, modern gaming is dead, is loaded with a lot of contextual meaning. What do we mean by modern? This is often a dog whistle in the same way that we observe degeneracy as a dog whistle. What do we mean by gaming? Well, Dr. Peterson, we certainly can't possibly be applying that term in this context to indie gaming, and even in the context of AA game studios, it's a bit tenuous. What do we mean by dead? You hear a lot of other words in its place, like failing or just plain awful and bad. Sometimes you hear in decline as well, which plays into the ideas we discussed earlier. Contemporary games released in recent years, are by and large doing just fine. But are we? Are we just fine? Do we feel fine? It's not just that games are more expensive, you know. You have to measure that cost in the context of your other expenses. How is rent these days? How are your wages? Do you enjoy paying tariffs or having your government benefits cut to create tax breaks for an ultra-wealthy class of nigh aristocratic superbillionaires? It's going to keep happening, you know. The incentives are the same. The ultra-wealthy are going to want to pay less and less in taxes, businesses are going to want to make more and more profit, and you're going to pay more and more while your employer wants to pay you less and less. Maybe you'll be one of a few upwardly mobile individuals, but you do not exist in a cultural landscape of your own making, so around you things will get worse as long as these incentives persist over a long enough time period. It's not necessarily apocalyptic, neither redounding to a great romantic collapse nor ending in a blinding flash of light. The culture fails not with a bang but with a whimper. Death is so sudden, so final. It's more like we're on life support. I can't tell you what to do. I'm not the Oracle of Delphi, but any way forward that ignores the character of the problem is going to require you to leave the truth behind. Modern gaming isn't dead. In many ways, it's thriving. But we have to do what's best for ourselves and what we love. We have to protect our fragile environment and our vulnerable freedoms. We can't just play on while the ship sinks. And we can't accept an easy lie because it flatters us more than a difficult truth. That's the final issue I have for you. Will you reject that something has to be done that actually addresses the underlying issues, or will you retreat into the comfort of the unevidenced assumption that there's nothing we can do and prefer the lie that there's nothing better on the horizon? A belief taken up for convenience without a shred of evidence is still a lie coming from someone who doesn't know. We have to admit that we don't know. We have to learn. Stop, listen, and check out what's going down.